washed the windows, and generally spruced the whole place up, Ampy stopped in her tracks and declared that what he was describing was simply housework. Gomer conceded that one could certainly call it that, when she asked if he was expected to do all that work entirely by himself. Gomer clarified that usually all the fellas took care of their own spaces, but since they were out on pass and he had no other plans, he was taking care of it for them. Ampy was taken aback by the idea that the young men had to do their own housework on top of all their marching and military drilling. Gomer explained that it was all considered part of being a Marine. Ampy expressed her shock, asking how long such a system had been going on. Gomer estimated it had been about 200 years. Ampy shook her head in disbelief, suggesting that one would think the military could spend a few extra dollars to hire a maid for the boys. Gomer tried to downplay her concern and invited her to sit down on his bunk so they could catch up while he mopped. Ampy flatly refused, asking if he honestly thought she was going to sit idly by and watch him do housework. She insisted on helping him immediately. Gomer tried to object, but Ampy told him firmly not to argue. She instructed him to find her a jacket or sweater to protect her dress, something to cover her hair, and a mop. Gomer protested again, but Ampy maintained her firm stance, telling him to simply do as she said. As she began to mop, Ampy reiterated her frustration with the system. She could not understand how millions upon millions of dollars were spent in taxes, yet the authorities refused to spend a few extra dollars for a woman to come in and clean up the barracks. She mentioned that Mavis Pearl back home could come in on a Thursday and clean the whole place for $8. Gomer gently suggested that money was probably not the real reason. Ampy asked what it could possibly be then, and Gomer repeated that doing housework was simply considered part of being a Marine. Ampy replied that if anyone asked her opinion, they ought to make a few changes, such as having a woman come in once or twice a week to make a proper difference. She looked around the room, pointing out that the windows could certainly use curtains and a few nice pictures would not hurt either. Gomer mentioned that some of the fellas did keep pictures, though they kept them stored on the inside of their locker doors. Ampy quickly clarified that those were certainly not the kind of pictures she had in mind. She then turned her attention to the windows Gomer was wiping down, observing that he was not getting them as clean as he should. She asked what cleaning solution he was using. Gomer held up the standard window cleaner supplied by the base. Ampy scoffed gently and declared that what he truly needed was vinegar mixed with a little water, which was what she always used back home. She asked if he happened to have any. Gomer admitted he did not, but offered to run over to the mess hall to see if he could procure some. Ampy urged him to go right away, reasoning that if a job was worth doing, it was worth doing right. Gomer hesitated, but Ampy insisted that the vinegar would make all the difference in the world. While Gomer hurried off to the mess hall, Sergeant Carter walked into the barracks. He stopped dead in his tracks upon seeing an elderly woman in a Marine jacket and cover mopping the floor. Ampy looked up, greeted him pleasantly, and wished him a lovely day. Sergeant Carter stood frozen in disbelief before telling her to be careful so she would not track up her clean floor. He then asked who she was. Ampy introduced herself as Miss Taylor and asked who he was in return. He identified himself as Sergeant Carter, then asked if she would answer one pressing question. What on earth was she doing there in the barracks? Ampy explained calmly that she was mopping the floor, which was obvious enough. Sergeant Carter clarified that he did not mean what task she was performing, but rather why a civilian woman was inside the Marine barracks at all. Ampy explained that she was visiting her dear friend, Private First Class Gomer-Pyle, and had decided to help him out with his duties. Sergeant Carter groaned as he recognized the name. Ampy suddenly pointed at the floor near his boots, scolding him for not wiping his feet and leaving marks all over the wet floor she had just mopped. Sergeant Carter tried to maintain his composure and addressed Miss Taylor politely, explaining that while he did not wish to seem rude, she really had to leave immediately. Ampy balked at the idea of leaving all the remaining work for Gomer. Sergeant Carter began to explain that military regulations strictly prohibited her presence. Just as Gomer returned, holding a small container, Gomer called out that he had found the vinegar, then froze as he noticed his superior officer. Sergeant Carter acknowledged Pyle's return, noting sarcastically that coming in without tracking mud was the proper way to enter a room. Gomer introduced Aunt Bee to Sergeant Carter, mentioning that he had written about the sergeant extensively in his letters home. Aunt Bee looked at Sergeant Carter closely, admitting that she had pictured him being a little taller based on Gomer's descriptions. Gomer quickly defended his commander, stating that while he might not be tall, he was as solid as a rock. Sergeant Carter addressed Aunt Bee formally, explaining that Private Pyle had clearly failed to inform her of base regulations. Civilians were strictly forbidden inside the barracks, so he had to ask her to vacate the premises. Aunt Bee protested that she had come to visit Gomer, but Sergeant Carter stood firm, stating that regulations were regulations. He pointed out that she could wait for Gomer in the recreation room down at the end of the street, though he warned it might be a long wait. He then instructed her to hand over the Marine jacket and cap before leaving. Aunt Bee complied reluctantly, removing the gear with Gomer's assistance. She assured Gomer that she would be waiting for him and expressed hope that he would not be delayed too long. Gomer promised to do his absolute best. As she stepped toward the door, Aunt Bee looked at the wet floor and gently reminded Sergeant Carter to watch where he stepped so as not to ruin the clean areas. Once Aunt Bee was out of earshot, Sergeant Carter exploded with rage. He berated Gomer, calling him a lame brain and a knucklehead, and demanded to know if he realized how many regulations he had broken in a single afternoon. He began counting them off on his fingers, having a civilian woman in the barracks, and allowing a civilian to wear official Marine gear. He shouted at Gomer, demanding to know when he was going to learn after 3 years in the Marines, and asking what it would take to get through his thick skull. Suddenly, Aunt Bee reappeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. She asked if everything was all right, noting that his voice sounded rather angry. Sergeant Carter caught himself instantly attempting to soften his demeanor as he claimed that nothing was wrong. Gomer chimed in to reassure Aunt Bee, explaining that Sergeant Carter talked to him like that all the time and there was no need to worry. Aunt Bee looked doubtful, but agreed to wait in the rec room, shaking her head at the awful mess. As soon as she left again, Sergeant Carter turned back to Gomer to inform him of the extra punishment details he was assigning. But before he could finish, Aunt Bee stepped back inside yet again, expressing her deep concern over how annoyed the sergeant seemed with Gomer. Gomer tried to downplay the situation, explaining that he just had to finish a few extra tasks before they could visit. When Aunt Bee asked what those tasks were, Gomer explained that he had been ordered to move a large sand pile from one spot to another and then move it right back to where it originally was. Aunt Bee was appalled by the senselessness of the task and realized immediately that Gomer was being punished because of her presence. Sergeant Carter interrupted, reminding Miss Taylor that civilians were not permitted to speak with Marines while they were on detail. He quickly offered to show her a shortcut to the front gate, directing her down the road where she could catch a bus into town. Out on the main street just outside the gates of Camp Henderson, a radio host named Johnny Clark was broadcasting his live show, interviewing visitors. He spotted Aunt Bee walking briskly away from the gate and approached her with a microphone, asking if she would share a few words about her visit to the base. Aunt Bee did not hold back. She expressed her absolute shock and disappointment, describing how she had been appalled by the behavior she witnessed. She recounted how a sergeant had been hollering and screaming at a fine young man, forcing him to move sand back and forth for no logical reason, and had practically pushed her down the road on her way out. Johnny Clark was thoroughly entertained by her sharp critique and realized he had hit broadcasting gold, noting that they were running out of airtime on the radio. He invited Aunt Bee to appear as a guest on his televised show the following evening. Aunt Bee agreed, eager to set the record straight and stand up for Gomer. Back at the barracks the next morning, news of the broadcast had reached the upper ranks. Sergeant Carter arrived